the NTIA's Middle Mile Program with its immediate past director, Sarah Bleau. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, thank you.
Really great to have you. And Denver is Sarah's hometown.
Yep.
And we actually decided to do this back when I was here, not that long ago, when we ran into each other at another conference. And just, we've seen so much work that's been happening on Middle Mile. And it is, I know many in this room understand the importance of Middle Mile and why Congress did allocate $1 billion in the Infrastructure Act that was passed on a bipartisan basis right at the end of 2021. But it's really important to just take a moment and think about the needs that we have in the United States. The Biden administration has worked really hard to put forward a plan, worked with Republicans and Democrats on the Hill to create an Internet for All agenda. So this is about connecting individuals that don't have any access to Internet today, as well as connecting those who are underserved. So those who may have some Internet, but it's just really not Internet that's going to prepare them for today, much less for the future of the United States. And Middle Mile's role is critically important because it connects those last mile networks to the Internet backbone. And everything is now riding on the Internet, and we're just going to see that more and more. Every industry is reliant upon Internet access, and so rural communities, ex-urban communities, they need this access. And Sarah came into her role not long after this was announced, and she was put in charge of this Middle Mile Program, which is a significant part of the Internet for All agenda, and we're just so thankful to have you so we can talk to you about how that is going. One of the first things she did after she joined NTIA and was put in charge of this program was she reached out to me and to the NCOMPAS policy team because she knew that the NCOMPAS members were likely to be involved in this program, and that's exactly what has happened. We have a number of our members who are now building in the Middle Mile Program, so we're just thrilled to have you.
Thank you.
And the other great news is that she did such a good job on the Middle Mile Program that she was promoted. So the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, personally asked Sarah to take on the Digital Equity Program. So at the end of our conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So congratulations.
Thank you.
It's really exciting, and I love to see someone like you who's been so successful be recognized, and that's great for us as an industry, but it's also great for the American people to have public servants who are really doing the job of helping us meet the Internet for All agenda, and the Digital Equity Program is going to be incredibly important to give people the skills that they need. So I'm looking forward to talking about that with you as well.
Yes.
All right, so let's dive in.
Okay.
Where are we right now with the Middle Mile Program? What is going on? Just give us a general update, and then we'll do some more specifics.
Sure. So we announced, I guess it was 2 years ago, that we began the program with taking the applications, and then we went through the reviews. And then last summer we announced, between last summer and September actually of 23, we announced the funding that we had. Mm-hmm. So today that means that we actually have awards totaling $940 million. This crosses, the size of these awards cross 38 states. I think 57% of the communities that these middle mile networks go through are what are considered rural. And the middle mile networks impact 43% of all U.S. counties. So it's a good-sized project. We have, if you go to our Broadband USA website, we have the maps of all of these networks. We also have dashboards so you can track the progress. Everybody is required to report every 6 months how they're doing against their milestones. And so this next round of reporting it closes October 30th, which means that the team will be evaluating, and then the results will be on our website on that dashboard, and you can track the progress. I think most important is of the 36 awards that we have right now, about 12 to 14 of them are expected to be completed in 2025.
Wow. And what was the time frame in which the projects had to do their completion?
We asked that the projects be completed within 5 years.
Right, so they're going to be completed 3 years in advance of the deadline.
And they vary in scope and what they're doing. So we have some, like I was in Pueblo, Colorado this weekend. There's Intrepid, who's building a network that goes on like more of the exurban areas of Pueblo, for example. That's a little bit smaller, and I would expect to see that one completed in 2025. On the other hand, we have some very complex projects. Like there's one up in Alaska that goes into the water, or off of the coast of Washington in the water. There's also one going across Lake Michigan. So some of these wet cable systems will take a little bit longer, not only because it's difficult to get the boat and the materials to do the work, but the environmental permitting part of it also takes a long time.
Yeah, so the two senators that really worked on this Middle Mile program, one in Maine, Senator King, and one in Nevada, Senator Rosen, right? So Senator King's an independent, Senator Rosen's a Democrat, worked together to put this program, and this was an individual bill that then got rolled into the Infrastructure Act. Tell us a little bit about how the projects were chosen. I know when we first talked, when it was like figuring out where were the needs, and what was the process by which NTIA could really assess where the needs were going to be, so that hopefully the BEAD program, the last mile programs, will be successful.
Well, of course, when you read the Notice of Funding Opportunity, there's the description of the 3 different reviews that we undergo in order to evaluate any kind of application. There's initial, where we check for the completeness, make sure people are eligible and on time. There's merit, where we actually have outside independent people looking at the application, and they score according to the merits of the application. And then there's finally programmatic, which is where me and my team come in and there's, like in the Middle Mile NOFO, there were, I think, 7 or 8 weighting factors that we took a look at. And in the end, those who scored the highest after merit scores plus the programmatic weights, those were the ones that were selected, accounting also for geographic diversity. So Assistant Secretary Alan Davison had the ability to say, I don't want everything to be in California. We have to have most of the state's territories kind of covered. So it was in the end, so the points were based on things like the communities that this is going through, how many of the children in these communities are on free and reduced lunch, or so that we use statistics like that to determine what was the need, and we benchmarked it against the data that was available to us. We also took a look at understanding that Middle Mile will not serve the last mile, but how many of these communities are unserved or underserved according to then FCC data. So we took a look at that. That was one of the things that we looked at. So there were these weighting factors that we took a look at, and in the end it was a very democratic process where the highest points account plus the geographic distribution is how we selected the awards.
And my recollection is that you had multiple times over the $1 billion amount of applicants who submitted applications. So there was significant need
absolutely
represented in this process. And I know you probably get asked this a lot, but it's $1 billion, and I think you had close to $5 billion worth of applications, right? And so what are the chances that there will be funding available through other sources, whether it's leftover BEAD money or some other pot of money, to address the middle mile needs that haven't been addressed to date?
Yes, we were very much oversubscribed. It was 5.5 or 6 times oversubscribed, so more than $5 billion requested in funding for the $1 billion that we had. And I think it's worth mentioning, the 5.5, 6 times oversubscription that we had, that was in spite of the fact that this was a very tough application. We had very high bars, like for example, the letter of credit. That was something that right out of the gate prohibited a lot of people from applying. So like 5.5 times, I think, is the least indicator of how much demand there really is for middle mile. I'll also say that it was important to me with all of the applications that we had, well, of course, there were those who were successful, and that was great, and everybody was happy. But for those who were not successful, it was important to me to have these debriefing conversations so that people had real feedback on where they did not look so strong in their application, and providing that kind of feedback so that they could, to hopefully empower them to do better in the future. When I had these debriefing conversations, one of the questions that I asked is if we could share the maps, the shapefiles that were given to us in the application with the state broadband offices, and most of them said yes. And what we did with that data is we took all of these unsuccessful applications, which sometimes they were already built. They were offering their networks as in-kind contribution. So we took all of these networks plus the awarded recipients, and then we plotted the FCC data, unserved and underserved, against all. There were 15 million locations, unserved and underserved, within 37 miles of all of these networks. We gave all of that data to the state broadband offices because I think it's very valuable.
Yeah.
Getting to your question, the reason I say that is because there's a huge demand for middle mile. If Internet for All is going to work, and we're going to have high-speed, quality bandwidth available at every household, and everybody knows how to use it, we need the middle mile in order to support that. And so, is $1 billion enough? I don't think so. Are there other opportunities for middle mile? Everybody wants to do more middle mile. One idea that has been talked about more and more recently is this idea that with the BEAD funding, there's non-deployment uses of money that could be used for middle mile. And it's not so much happening, as far as I can tell, in the western states because we're so large and people are more distributed. But a lot of states closer to the East Coast or in that general vicinity, they are going to have money left over after BEAD. They've got all of their people served, so they do plan to use some of this non-deployment, they call it non-deployment money. They'll be using BEAD money for middle mile.
And I want to go and just unpack a little bit a snippet of information you just provided us, which I think is critical for everybody in this room. And that is, when you first started, one of the first questions you asked me was, Angie, is there a map somewhere that shows where all the middle mile is? And I was like, there are commercial tools available. But no, when the Congress passed the Broadband Data Act, the focus was on last mile. And that is the information that the ISPs provide to the FCC that make up the broadband map. So you can see where customers now, and that took a while, it's a process, right? But you can now see household by household, what speeds they have available and which providers are providing service to those households and over which technology, which is great, but we didn't have middle mile information, right? We didn't know where all the networks are. So the fact that you now have been able to gather that information and then share that with the state broadband offices is something that's really important that I think maybe has been missed. At least it was missed by me, in the industry, about how much more information now these state broadband offices have as they are thinking through where they may have money left over. What are the best ways to use that money to, again, achieve the Internet for All agenda?
Right, like you might not have to reinvent the wheel and build all new. You might be able to tap into some of what's already been thought about, proposed, or is in place. And as much as we can, we've made that information available to the states.
Well, I know many of the folks in this room have been working directly with their state broadband offices. And I think that this is just reinforces the importance of those of you with network to be doing that, to be sure that your state broadband office knows about your network capabilities in your locations, so that when they're making these decisions, they know where the holes are and they know where there are opportunities to suggest that the last mile ISPs, buy connectivity from you. Yeah,
definitely.
So that's really fantastic. Okay, I did want to say you all might have questions for Sarah, and she's willing to take questions from the audience. So please, we will come back to you. I'm going to ask one, and then I'm going to, so be thinking about what you want to ask.
Nice questions.
Yeah, they're, of course, always be really, really nice. Okay, so we're about a year into the build process, and it's great. I know you have heard some of them are on schedule to be finished in 2025. That's awesome. But any concerns that you're hearing from the process of building, and or anything else, good news, bad news, like what are you hearing directly from those who are in the process of building the middle mile?
I think that one of the biggest challenges that is not across the board, but that is impacting some of the middle mile awardees, is the fact that the applications people began working on this in 2022. So budgets were based on 2022 numbers, and here we are. I keep forgetting what year it is, but it actually is
2024. I do the same thing. Yeah.
And that is something, and we don't have any, I'm sorry, we do not have any more money to hand out for this program. And so that's what we're seeing sometimes, is that costs have increased, or that perhaps there were, some states have very stringent and costly permitting processes. Like, people actually have to be hired to watch as you're digging every inch along the way, or stranding the fiber up on the poles.
Yeah.
So there were some costs that have increased and that were not accounted for. The other thing that I'll say is that when you get federal money, there's NEPA, EHP, whatever it is that you want to call it. It's the Environmental Historical Preservation Act work that is attached to all federal dollars. And I think many people who build networks know permitting processes very well. NEPA is a different item. It's a different issue, and NTIA and the Department of Commerce deals with NEPA a little bit differently than the FCC might have dealt with NEPA. And so that's something else that I hear about often, is that recipients didn't necessarily account for the cost and the time that it would take to clear NEPA. And so my advice, if we were able to do this all again, I would definitely recommend that people hire environmental consultants, because they are worth their weight in gold. They are the ones who speak the same language as our EHP teams and can turn these documents around. We're doing everything that we can. For example, we just signed an MOU with Forest Service, and that helps to expedite the NEPA process. But I would hire an environmental consultant. The other thing that I'll say, for those recipients that we have whose costs have increased, fortunately, they oftentimes were able to build some kind of contingency into their budget, to a 10% contingency. So they're still able to make things work. But that would be my advice to anybody going forward.
That's helpful to hear. One of the things that we've also been gathering from members is workforce needs. And I've heard more that for BEAD, that's going to be a significant consideration. But are you hearing anything about the workforce needs in the Middle Mile program? Or are all of these companies, well-staffed and able to fulfill the promises and obligations?
Middle Mile is a smaller set than 1 billion versus billions and billions.
Yeah, 42
so,
and a half.
Yeah. So we're not hearing the same concerns as far as workforce. One message that we talk to the Middle Mile recipients regularly, one-on-one as FPOs, but I also was hosting office hours throughout the last year, every 2 weeks, with Middle Mile recipients. And one message that we try to communicate over and over, and that I try to live, and it's hard, but not working in a silo, not working in a vacuum, understanding, so for example, when we were talking about maps, we were able to pull in, the Department of Labor has, I think it's called HRTP or something like that. So it's all the money that they're spending across the nation building training facilities, building certification. So we filtered it out, and as much as we could tie it into any kind of telecom worker, we've pulled that in and we've identified that, and we're sharing that with Middle Mile recipients and anybody else who's interested in it. But not working in a, so we're not having those workforce problems per se with Middle Mile, but we are often talking to Middle Mile recipients about don't just put your head down and focus only on your project. Think also about, like, I'm very much going off the mark here, but I think it's worth mentioning there are a couple of Middle Mile recipients, like the state of Kansas, for example, has done an outstanding job in having public workshops to talk about where their interconnects are going to be, what their specs for interconnects, and I think that's such a huge, it's such a huge conversation. I know Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson's always out there talking about middle mile being the force multiplier for BEAD, and we can't wait for middle mile to just be built and then say, hey, here's where we are. We need to be having these conversations right now as any last mile BEAD hopeful is planning their networks. Where are they going to meet the middle mile? How are they going to meet the middle mile? And so, no, it's not a challenge on workforce, but continuing to prod our middle mile recipients to think about these kinds of questions so that they can prepare for BEAD and any BEAD participant down the road.
Thank you. All right, I want to open it up because we've got about 20 minutes, and I know that some of you in the audience may have some questions for Sarah. Okay, there's one right here. They'll bring you a microphone. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself. Thank you.
Good morning, Sarah. Thank you for coming today. My name is Asim Raza. I'm General Counsel at Arcadian Infocom in St. Louis. You touched on a little bit about the permitting aspect, which, as you know, can be a huge challenge during the process. Has there been any discussion about simplifying the permitting process, or have you heard anything along those lines?
Well, thank you for asking that question. Yes, it's something that is top of mind all of the time. Permitting does take a long time. We're having conversations. Jill Springer, who's on our team, has been doing a lot. She's, for example, as soon as she joined the team, she's thinking about BEAD. She started having regional workshops with all of the agencies to talk about, we kind of did heat maps to say, here's a large concentration of unserved and underserved people in the Northwest area. And so then we overlaid that on Forest Service and wetlands and critical habitats and native entity tribal lands and all. And actually this permitting map is available to all of you on our website. If you go to Broadband USA under resources, there's a permitting map, and so you'll have access. You can download these files. You can see where we're getting it from. She overlaid all this, kind of did a heat map to show where the unserved and underserved were, and brought all those agencies to the table with stakeholders to begin having the conversations about, number one, look at this plethora of applications you're going to be getting because there's so many people who need the help. And then number two, as you think about it, what kind of processes can be improved? I haven't seen anything definitive come out of that, but if nothing else, I think it reinforces the conviction that we need to be talking early and often and regularly with all of our stakeholders in order to make permitting a better experience for all of us. So I don't have any answers for you. I can tell you, though, that it is top of mind.
Yeah, Jill also participated in a day-long stakeholder event that was hosted in Washington at Georgetown Law's Institute for Law and Technology. And this involved the federal government, so NTIA, the White House, as well as industry stakeholders, NCOMPAS, and other trade associations that represent ISPs, and cities who have had great success, and some of the lawyers who've really fought back, honestly, on some of the streamlining that we at NCOMPAS have been pushing. But what I thought was really interesting about that day is that while there were some disagreements, there was a lot of agreement in the room. One, the importance of broadband and why we need to be building broadband as fast and affordably as possible. The economic benefits to communities that come along with that high-speed connectivity. And the second thing that I heard that I thought was also just important that folks were agreeing on was the fact that we need to be talking to each other often and continuously, right? It's not a one and done. It's working directly with those who you need to get your permits from, making sure that you've given them plenty of notice about exactly what your plans are, and then what it is that you may need from their process. And some cities have been more prepared than others, directly as a result of the work that the industry has done with NCOMPAS to recognize the importance of moving things more electronically, electronically, being able to do batch permitting, so all of these various things that we've been talking about for a couple of years and that are now reflected in our Ready City checklist that our members have supported. And as a result of that day-long event, the Benton Institute for Broadband put out a very lengthy report with a number of recommendations based directly on the stakeholder input. And these conversations are hard, right? They really are. And sometimes it is about the money. How much, are you going to pay for access to the rights of way, and what's the time frame going to be, and what exactly are you doing to our streets, et cetera, et cetera. These are hard conversations, but they're conversations that we have to be having, and we need to have often, and we need to continuously have. So I've been really impressed by the amount of work that NTIA has to undertake. This is, you're in charge of the $1 billion program, but then there's also the $42.5 billion program, right? That is significant, and the number of people that NTIA had to hire, as well as then gather information and figure out what does the federal government know, what does it not know, and then work with stakeholders across the board, from industry to public interest to the state broadband offices and tribal nations. It has been a significant amount of work in a very short time frame.
Yep. And there's that kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, and also talking about permits still, there's that official march that we're doing to make all this happen. But one of the other things that I really enjoy about this job is that, like, about a month ago we convened, annually we have the State Broadband Leaders Network that we get everybody on site somewhere, and we talk about all the issues, and lately the conversations have mostly been about BEAD. And this is the first year that I was invited to attend and talk about Middle Mile, and we also included the Tribal Broadband Leaders Network. One of the things that was really cool was among the handful of Middle Mile awardees that we have, there are some who own poles, and they actually came to us proactively, interested in sharing how it is that they evaluate pole applications. Encouraging these kinds of conversations with the state broadband offices, and getting back to this, I sound like the bleeding heart that I was when I was an undergrad and shaved my head and went crazy, like that. But I mean it, that this really is taking all of us all together. It is maybe we have these grassroots kind of conversations where the people who own the poles are actually out in the field regionally talking to the people who need to use the poles, or talking to the municipalities, talking to the people who are bringing, who have the BEAD money. I think we need to be having more of these conversations rather than just pointing our fingers. And I'm not suggesting that that's what's happening, but we need to be working constructively together in order to understand what is the process, how are you a little bit different, how does this cost more or take more time, etc.
Yeah, and it's and I do believe that is a significant development through all of this work. But I still also appreciate that there are some issue areas that really are just issues that need to be addressed through enforcement. And we have one member in Texas who is continuing to have problems with one particular power company. And my advice to that member has been, I think, you've talked and talked and talked and talked, and they're just not budging, and they essentially don't want to abide by the one-touch make-ready rules, which apply in Texas. And I'm like, I think you're at the point where you're just going to have to file a complaint at the FCC, and the FCC now has this faster process that you can go through that in part was because of the work that Chris Shipley does at NCOMPAS to represent our members, that we now have this process. And I was like, I really think it's time for you to pull the trigger on it. Sometimes you're just going to have to use the enforcement mechanisms, and there are just going to be some companies that maybe are never going to come around and want to work with our industry on the same goals that we have. And when I did a little bit of research on this particular company, I discovered that they had opposed the one-touch make-ready rules and actually took it to a circuit court. And so, of course, they just don't want to abide by them, right? But it's like, this essentially is the law. They have to abide by it. So sometimes companies, talking is great. Getting to an agreement is wonderful, and I highly recommend it. It's a lot cheaper than bringing a complaint at the FCC, but sometimes you might just have to pull the trigger and file the complaint.
Yep.
So that was a great question. We really took that and ran with it. So Any other questions from the audience? Okay, great, Chris.
Hey, Sarah. Chris Champion with C-Spire. Thanks again for being here and the work that we've been able to do with your agency on our Middle Mile grant. Just a comment and a question. The permitting website that you mentioned, I think that's an excellent tool. It's going to be great as we continue to build out. I wish we had it at the beginning of the process for our application for Middle Mile, but thanks for the work that y'all have done to put that together, because it's really going to change. I think people like us are going to be able to use that as we build out. You mentioned an MOU between NTIA and forestry, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
I don't know as much about it. I did read that it was just put in place. I think that this there are these conversations about being a lead agency, and so I think that my understanding is that it makes, in those cases, NTIA the lead agency over the Forest Service so that we can drive the EHP and get those actions taken. But I don't know the exact details. I'd be happy to dig into it more and share that with you.
And I'll put a plug in here, Chris. So I'm having a webinar with Jill next week on the 31st, so we can tee that up as one of the questions for Jill as well. And for those of you who want to sign up to just hear more about this work that Jill Springer is doing at NTI, I encourage you to watch this webinar. We tape them and make them available on our YouTube channel, so even if you miss it at the time that it airs live, you can catch up on it later. So I thought the work that Jill's been doing is just extraordinary, and it's hard because they're gathering all this information from all the different agencies, right, and try to put it all in one toolkit. This is not easy to do, and so I really wanted to have a one-on-one with her so she could talk to our membership about what the work that she's been doing and how it is that this may be helpful in your deployment of network, whether it's through these programs or through private sector investment. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the fact that you're now handing off the baton to Chris Holt.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your advice to Chris, because you want to make sure that the baton doesn't get dropped.
And he won't. Chris has been with NTIA for a number of years. He was one of the BTOP FPOs, so he's got a lot of experience. One of his strengths is that he knows how to. It's very important as we look at monitoring and making sure that deployment occurs on time and all this stuff. Chris is excellent at that. My advice to him is you used the phrase earlier, this is not one and done. This is not, let's just get 12 Middle Mile projects done in 2025, but this is, how is Middle Mile going to feed into BEAD, and how are we actually going to make this internet for all? So that's my advice to him, is don't look short term, but to think over the horizon about how can this be meaningful to all Americans when we think about internet for all.
Yeah. And then tell us a little bit about your new project, the Digital Equity Program.
So there's the Digital Equity Act, and a couple years ago when the infrastructure law came out and we said BEAD would be bad without equity, that's what this is. There's the digital equity money that's built into that. The states got a chunk of it for the DE capacity program. They also got money for planning. I'm running the competitive program, and so we just closed on that application window a month ago on September 23rd. Today is the window closed for the 4 territories to turn in their applications. It's close to $1 billion this fiscal year. There's this idea that there are covered populations, and that's things like where we look at the rurality of the community, or the poverty levels, or we look at veterans or incarcerated individuals, for example. There are those covered populations, and what we're looking for with the Digital Equity Competitive Program is that people have projects either to, let me say, how many people here in the room, show of hands, know somebody who was impacted when ACP went away? That hurt us all, and I'm not here to do anything except to say that is something that we look at with Digital Equity Competitive Program, is a sustainable program to make sure maybe there are other ways to be doing, we're not funding new builds or anything like that, but making sure, is there a way that there's more available internet packages available for people who perhaps were impacted by ACP going away. We're also looking at, for those of us who can't afford $1,000 a year going to college for a degree, training programs, workforce development, certification, that there's digital equity money that can be spent with that. So the Digital Equity Competitive Program is very different from Middle Mile, whereas with Middle Mile we had largely for-profits who were applying, or state and local governments. The Digital Equity Competitive Program is nonprofits and state and locals. So we're in the throes, we're wrapping up initial review right now. Next we go into the merit review, and then finally programmatic. The NOFO states that we will be announcing awards this winter. And I have an amazing team of dedicated people, and we're just working tirelessly to make that happen.
And in terms of the application, did you see a similar result as you did in Middle Mile, like many more applications than the money that's available to fulfill those applications?
Yeah, we announced last week, again, close to $1 billion for fiscal year 24, or this right now. And we had more than $6 billion being requested in funding. And keep in mind too, I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that the Middle Mile, when you're talking about construction where you're, $10, $50, $100,000 a mile to build places, and so the average size of award for Middle Mile was tens of millions of dollars. And here with the DE competitive program, the guidance we provided is that we expected awards between $5 and $12 million. So we're going to have many projects. Of course, it costs a lot less to run a training program than it does to build a network, but we will have many projects. And in spite of that, we were very much oversubscribed.
Does anyone have any questions about the Digital Equity Program they'd like to ask? Okay, great. Well, we went through my list.
All right.
And you stayed a little extra. We had a little extra time, so thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Appreciate you coming by.
Happy to be here.
She was here earlier during the conference too, and I hope you can come tonight to the disco party. It'll be a lot of fun. And I hope you all can make it as well. So please, let's give Sarah a round of applause. Thank you.